There were many terrifying moments in the Great War, but none felt as sharp as the 5 minutes that changed the course of nations and decided the fate of thousands. It was a moment so intense that even the veterans who survived it later said those minutes felt longer than the entire war. The air was thick with fear, the ground trembled from the weight of engines and footsteps, and every soldier on both sides knew that what happened in those 5 minutes would echo through history. It began in the early hours of a tense morning when an entire battlefield seemed to be holding its breath. The sky was still dark, the wind whispered through broken trees, and every man knew something was coming. They could feel it in their bones, they could sense it in the silence that seemed too heavy, too unnatural. The enemy was preparing a decisive strike, a blow meant to crush defenses, destroy morale, and seize the advantage once and for all. On the frontline, soldiers stood ready, gripping their rifles, their hands shaking not from cold but from the weight of the moment. They looked at each other with expressions that carried both fear and determination. Some whispered brief prayers, some thought of their families, and some simply stared into the darkness, waiting for the first signal that would unleash chaos across the battlefield. Far behind them, commanders studied their maps in dim light. They understood the stakes better than anyone. They knew that if the enemy broke through even for a few minutes, the entire line would collapse. If that happened, supplies would be cut, reinforcements stranded, and retreat inevitable. This was not just another military clash, it was the thin red line holding back disaster. Then it began. The first explosion tore through the still air with a force that shook the ground. Soldiers threw themselves to the dirt as a wave of fire and smoke rolled across the fields. In the distance, aircraft engines roared to life and artillery thundered from hidden positions. The bombardment had started, and everyone understood that the next 5 minutes would determine everything. Enemy forces charged forward with terrifying speed. They had planned this attack for months, studying every weakness, every gap, every hesitation. They knew exactly where to strike and exactly when to strike. Their soldiers ran through smoke and debris, shouting battle cries that cut through the chaos like knives. Their tanks rolled over shattered earth, grinding it beneath heavy metal treads. The defenders fought back with equal fury, firing every weapon they had, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew the enemy had the advantage, but they also knew retreat was not an option. They held their positions with desperate courage, moving from cover to cover, calling out warnings, helping wounded comrades, even as fire rained down around them. The first minute passed like lightning, a blur of noise, light, and violence. The attackers surged forward, confident that their momentum would overwhelm the defenders, but the defenders did not break. They held the line, forming a human wall of resistance that refused to collapse no matter how fierce the assault became. By the second minute, the battlefield was a storm of smoke, mud, and fire. The air was so thick with dust that soldiers could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The ground shook with every explosion. Trees splintered into fragments, buildings crumbled under bombardment, and still the defenders fought. Their uniforms torn, their faces blackened by smoke. They fired until their rifles overheated, then switched to whatever weapons they could find. In the third minute, the attackers reached the trenches. This was where the fighting turned hand to hand, where every second became a struggle to survive. Soldiers grappled in the mud, using fists, knives, and bayonets, because there was no room left to fire. Rifles, shouts, cries, and the sound of metal striking metal filled the air. The trenches became a swirling chaos of bodies struggling for dominance. The defenders were pushed to the brink. Their line wavered. The enemy had gained ground, and for a moment victory seemed within reach. The attackers shouted triumphantly, believing the 5-minute breakthrough was finally happening. They could almost taste victory. They pushed harder, driven by the belief that the defenders were about to fall. But in the 4th minute, something changed. A small group of defenders launched a desperate counterattack, charging forward with a burst of courage that came from pure survival instinct. They threw themselves into the fight, catching the attackers off guard. The sudden push created a momentary gap in the enemy formation, a crack that widened quickly as more defenders joined the counterattack. The attackers hesitated for the first time. That hesitation was enough. The defenders exploited it with every ounce of strength they had left. They pushed forward, reclaiming lost ground, shoving the attackers back step by The battlefield turned into a vicious tug-of-war, each side fighting fiercely for every inch of soil. By the 5th minute, both sides were exhausted. The air was filled with smoke, the ground soaked with sweat and blood. The attackers were regrouping for one final push, determined to break the line once and for all. They gathered their strength, raised their weapons, and prepared to charge. But then came the sound that changed everything. Reinforcements had arrived. The defenders had been fighting alone, but now fresh soldiers rushed onto the battlefield. Their arrival had been timed perfectly. They stormed forward with renewed energy, shouting as they charged into the fray. The attackers suddenly found themselves overwhelmed, pinned between two forces with no escape route. The tide turned instantly. The defenders surged forward with a unity and strength they had not felt all night. Their fatigue vanished, replaced by the desperate will to win. The attackers, who had been so confident moments earlier, realized too late that their window of victory had closed. Their formation crumbled, their momentum evaporated in those final seconds. The battlefield shifted completely. The attackers began to retreat, stumbling through smoke and debris, trying to escape the relentless push of the defenders. What had begun as a near-guaranteed breakthrough had turned into chaos and defeat. The attackers scattered, leaving behind equipment, wounded comrades, and the shattered remains of their plan. When the dust finally settled, the most dangerous 5 minutes of the war had passed. The defenders looked around at the destruction, their breaths heavy, their bodies shaking. They had survived, but the cost was enormous. The trenches were filled with wounded men, debris, and the remnants of desperate struggle. The air still crackled with the memory of explosions. The earth still trembled with the echo of violence. Commanders walked among the survivors, stunned by what they had witnessed. They understood that the fate of the entire campaign had hinged on those few minutes. They realized how close they had come to disaster and how narrow the margin between victory and defeat had been. The defenders had held the line through sheer willpower and bravery. Their resistance during those 5 minutes had saved countless lives, prevented collapse, and altered the course of the war. Across the battlefield, soldiers sat quietly, staring into the distance, trying to comprehend what they had just lived through. They spoke softly to each other, their voices trembling. Some laughed in relief, others cried openly, some simply sat in silence, overwhelmed by the weight of survival. They knew they had faced one of the most intense moments of the war and come out alive against all odds. News of the battle spread quickly through military channels. Messages were sent to headquarters reporting the narrow escape and praising the courage of the defenders. Leaders who had feared the worst felt a wave of relief wash over them. They knew that had those 5 minutes gone differently, the consequences would have been catastrophic. The enemy would have captured key positions, destroyed supply lines, and opened a path to victory. In the days that followed, soldiers walked the battlefield, remembering every detail of that morning. They pointed to the places where they had fought, where they had lost friends, where they had held the line against overwhelming force. The land itself seemed changed, scarred by the violence of that short but brutal clash. Historians later studied the event, calling those 5 minutes a turning point, a moment when the tide of the war balanced on a knife edge. They marveled at how such a brief moment of time could hold so much weight, could carry the power to change the fate of nations. They wrote about the bravery of the soldiers who refused to give up even when defeat seemed certain. They described the chaos, the struggle, the desperation, and the unexpected triumph. The most dangerous 5 minutes in the war were not defined by the weapons or the numbers, but by the courage of ordinary soldiers who refused to break. They held a line that seemed doomed and fought with a strength that came not from training but from the belief that their actions mattered, that their stand would protect their friends, their families, and their future. Those 5 minutes stand today as a reminder of how fragile victory can be and how quickly everything can change. They remind us that history is shaped not only by long battles and grand strategies, but by moments of sheer human will, moments when everything hangs in the balance and the actions of a few can shape the fate of many. And so the story of those 5 minutes lives on, a story of chaos, courage, desperation, and hope, a story of the thin line between victory and defeat, a story of how 5 minutes of unbreakable resolve became one of the most defining moments in the long, brutal struggle of the war.